Welcome to this virtual conversation with the Senate Republican leader, Mitch McConnell. The topic, American leadership at home and abroad. Coming to you, I'm Major Garrett from my office here at the CBS Bureau, downtown Washington, D.C. Two American classics in the background, Mario Puzo's The Godfather and Norman Rockwell, a lithograph behind me. Senator McConnell, good to see you. How are you, sir?
Glad to be with you.
As you well know, Senator, John McCain had lots to say about Vladimir Putin. Let me just go down a couple of the comments that strike me in the current context. 2016, Vladimir Putin is a thug and a killer, direct quote from Senator McCain. 2017, Putin's the world's most important threat, bigger than Islamic terrorism, both May 2017. 2018, Putin is an evil man. If Senator McCain were with us now, what do you think he would be saying? How do you think he would be trying to drive the debate about U.S. efforts to save Ukraine?
Well, the first thing he'd say is, I told you so. And the second thing I think he would say was to commend the late Madeleine Albright, who before her passing actually apologized to Mitt Romney for what he said during the 2012 campaign, and that the Russians were our biggest international threat. So I think everything John said about Putin was accurate at the time and only further proven to be true by recent events.
And Senator McCain was not bashful at all about Congress asserting itself in the policy of national security. Evaluate for all of us, Senator McConnell, how Congress has stepped in and either in some cases driven policy in Ukraine or helped shape it through the Biden administration.
Well, I think clearly on a bipartisan basis, we've pushed the administration to do more sooner, to show you how their position has evolved in the direction of where we are in Congress, where most of us are. Secretary Austin was asked a couple of weeks ago, I believe, by Senator Cotton, what was our goal in Ukraine. I, for one, had been saying for a week before that, our goal ought to be to win. Well, just yesterday, as we're taping this, just yesterday, Secretary Austin did say in Kyiv, at the first meeting of an American official of high ranking inside the country, that our goal was for Ukraine to win. So I think the Congress has pushed the administration to do things with regard to deterring the Russians sooner at every stage. And generally speaking, the administration's caught up at some point.
And I'm glad you mentioned the sequence, Senator McConnell. We're recording this on April 25th. It will be published later. So some of the comments we will make are sort of in the moment. I guarantee you they'll last for the entire week. In that regard, do you think Ukraine can win? And what more should the United States do to achieve that? And should the president be more emphatic that that is the overall and overarching U.S. policy?
Well, I think Ukraine must win, not just for the Ukrainians, but for all the rest of us. This is the first land war of any major proportions in Europe since World War II. It illustrates further the decision I and others made at the end of the Cold War to expand NATO into the countries that were previously part of the Soviet bloc. John McCain was very much in favor of that as well. And so we pushed the boundaries of NATO over against the Russians in the Baltics, Poland, Romania. There are two countries that chose not to join up, Sweden and Finland. And as we're speaking, public opinion seems to have shifted in both Finland and Sweden in recommending that maybe they should join NATO. So if Putin thought this was going to divide NATO, it's done just the opposite. NATO is the most unified it has been. I think one potential threat was resolved in the French election the day before we are speaking, with someone who is sympathetic to the Russians and been quite outspoken about that, was not elected president of France. I think that's another step in the right direction. German policy which has been rather neutral, the end of the war, somewhat understandable given all the Germans did during World War II, seems to have evolved into a role more consistent with the needs of the free world, the democratic world now, by indicating they're going to increase defense spending, by suggesting they're going to send serious weapons to the Ukrainians. So I think one good thing that's come out of this is the most unified and determined NATO since it was created in 1949.
So, Senator McConnell, some very practical things. First of all, as we are recording this on this day, President Biden has formally nominated Bridget Brink as the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. Do you foresee any problems with that confirmation, and evaluate how long it took for it to come to the Senate?
I don't know her, but I do think we need an ambassador there. Apparently, we're restoring our diplomatic presence as you and I are recording this. And I think that's a good decision, and getting an ambassador out there quickly would also make a lot of sense.
There is also a pending matter in terms of another request from the administration for supplemental funding for military assistance and other assistance to Ukraine. About 13.6 billion so far, if I have my numbers correctly. There was 3 billion set aside in the most recently passed omnibus. The administration says that is running low. There needs to be more. And there is a sense that that is supported on a bipartisan basis, but might be directly linked to any additional COVID funding, which could also have policy matters related to Title 42 attached to it. To the degree you can, specify where these things are and where they're heading.
Well, I think there's significant bipartisan opposition to the step that the administration seems about to take on Title 42 related to security at the southern border. I frankly think, given the Democratic demand for continuing Title 42, my hope and expectation is that the administration will change that policy or let us have an amendment which would guarantee that current policy stays in place.
And do you see the money for COVID relief, the extra 10 billion, and any future allocations for Ukraine inexorably tied together, or can they be separated? And should they be separated?
Well, I'd love to be the majority leader of the Senate.
I know, sir. I know, sir.
A decision for Senator.
But your voice does matter.
That'll be a decision for Senator Schumer to make as to how to package it. But look, there's overwhelming bipartisan desire to continue the status quo with regard to Title 42 at the border. The administration could, on its own, change that. Otherwise, I think we're going to need to have an amendment on that subject. There is a demonstrable need for additional COVID money. We've found a way to pay for that, and I think somehow we'll work this out. And if there's another request for Ukraine, I think there's an overwhelming likelihood it'll be approved.
So as you well know, Senator McConnell, the administration has been very clear about what it will not do in Ukraine. It will not send U.S. ground forces. It has no intention of engaging the Russians in the airspace over Ukraine. But there are those who look at the scenario on the ground playing out and saying, that is not a recipe for Ukrainian victory. That is a recipe for a long slog, lots of civilian casualties, and gradual annexation by Russia of eastern parts of Ukraine, which will give it a permanent springboard for future menacing of that country, whatever happens with the rest of the military onslaught launched by Vladimir Putin. And there are those who believe now is the time to reconsider U.S. air combat to preserve lives on the ground, meaning Ukrainian civilians, defeat the Russians, and change the dynamic of this conflict. Your thoughts?
Well, I think the Secretary of Defense just said he thought the Ukrainians could defeat the Russians. I believe the Ukrainians can defeat the Russians, and I think they can do it without direct American involvement. We need to keep sending them what they need. As one of my colleagues once said a few weeks ago, we need to send them anything that will shoot that they ask for, and we need to stick with them and not lose interest here if this turns into a long slog.
Well, your colleague, Senator Chris Coons, gave a speech about a week ago saying his fear is what you just said, that the long slog will fatigue Americans, that we will turn our attention away, and parts of Ukraine could become reminiscent of Syria, a bloody, costly, grinding civil war that doesn't have any resolution, that the Russians are deeply involved in and ultimately prevailing. Do you have those similar anxieties?
Well, rather than predicting an adverse outcome, I think the goal ought to be to win. And the Ukrainians, I think, have demonstrated their will to fight, their ability to fight. And it's up to leaders like Senator Coons and myself to continue to say, let's stick with the Ukrainians until they win. And the definition of victory, in my view, is whatever President Zelensky says victory is.
Even if that might include some territorial concessions to Russia.
Look, I'm not going to speculate about what President Zelensky may conclude is terms upon which he's willing to end the conflict.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly not his position now, and I think that's his call to make, not ours.
For Congress and for the American people, I'd like you to evaluate something the Polish ambassador to the United States told me about a week and a half ago. He said, there is this tendency to fixate entirely on Vladimir Putin, but it is, and he was speaking on behalf of the Polish government, the belief of that government that it's the Russian people that are as much to blame for the war in Ukraine and that you can't separate one from the others. And he said this will be and ought to be a complication for US-Russia relations going forward. It's not just Vladimir Putin, his belief. Your thoughts?
Well, he's the head of the government, and as long as the government is acting like it is, we're not going to have normal relations with him going forward. So it's really up to him to decide, how upon what conditions we're going to continue to have some kind of relationship. I feel badly for the Russian people. There are dissenters in Russia. They're treated rather harshly, as we all know. It's a dictatorial regime. John McCain was right about Vladimir Putin when he said the things that you quoted at the beginning of our discussion. And he's certainly demonstrated that for the world to see here in the last couple of months.
I'd like to get your thoughts, Senator McConnell, on how the situation in Ukraine does or does not, or will not incentivize China vis-a-vis Taiwan.
Well, I hope President Xi is looking at this and concluding that taking Taiwan would not be risk-free in terms of his commercial relationships with NATO countries. The Chinese are much more integrated into the world economy than the Russians are, much more dependent upon the world economy than the Russians are. Query, would he like to be subject to all of the sanctions? Number two, the Russians discovered the Ukrainians really were willing to put up a fight. I wonder what he thinks about Taiwan. Is it worth what damage might be done as a result of a military incursion? So I hope the message he's taking out of this, it's a lot better to not be a pariah in the international community.
And China also wants to be a credible voice on the world stage. It talks incessantly, that's my word, not yours, about the importance of sovereignty. And yet it has done plenty of things at the margins, and it may do more things in the future to aid and abet Russia's violation of Ukraine's sovereignty.
Yeah, I think he's tried to have it both ways, and is sitting on the fence trying to observe how all of this turns out, which is another reason it's important that Ukraine win the conflict.
As you well know, Senator McConnell, the world's most populous democracy is India. I had a long conversation with Senator Mark Warner a couple of weeks ago, and he said he was deeply disappointed also by India's role in this, sitting on the fence and not really casting its lot on behalf of democracy in Ukraine. Your thoughts on that? I
agree with Senator Warner. It is disappointing. It's not too late for the Indians to take another look at this and come out on the right side.
Is there anything more that the administration could or should be doing in Asia generally, either with China or India, to expedite either of these two outcomes that you just talked about?
Well, I really think Ukrainian victory is the best message that can be sent not only to the fence sitters like the Indians and the Chinese, but to what few sympathizers the Russians have in the civilized world.
Should Ukraine, as it stands right now, be invited into NATO? Has it already earned its membership stripes, if you will, sort of rhetorically?
That's a tough question. I do think an easier first step for the Ukrainians might be to get into the European Union.
There's already talk of doing that on an expedited basis.
Yeah, I think that might be a good first step.
And what in your mind, Senator McConnell, makes it a difficult question about NATO membership?
Well, it just adds one more country to the line of defense, and I think it's a much more complicated question than what we're dealing with right now, which is to help the Ukrainians win the war.
Mm-hmm. So I'd like to ask you about American leadership at home and abroad, particularly as the world evaluates or attempts to evaluate the solidity of American democracy. What is your level of confidence in the believability and the verifiability of the upcoming midterm elections?
It'll be completely viable, and people will respect the outcome of the elections that are duly certified.
And do you think there is something that's worth discussing in America about accepting election results, even if you lose? It seems, Senator McConnell, from my vantage point, some of that has been lost in the last 18 or 22 months, that there is a degree of entitlement. If I'm not satisfied that my side won, I might challenge an election.
Well, we had a lot of that after the 2016 election from the Democrats. We had it after the 2018 election from Stacey Abrams, who was the Democratic candidate for governor in Georgia, who never conceded. I think those were steps in the wrong direction, and certainly to not accept the certified results of the 2020 election was also a step in the wrong direction. But none of those prevailed. None of those prevailed. The candidate with the most votes won on all three occasions, 16, 18, and 20.
And is there a cautionary tale from your vantage point, Senator McConnell, for both sides about playing that kind of game with democracy?
Yeah, I think it's a mistake to question the results when clearly there's no evidence of enough fraud to change the outcome.
What has been your overall assessment, thinking about American leadership, of the Biden administration's approach to the topic of immigration? It's not a new topic. Certainly, the candidacy of Donald Trump, the presidency of Donald Trump, made it abundantly clear Americans, not just on border states, care about this issue. How would you evaluate their approach, and how would you evaluate the current politics?
Well, of course, the Obama administration, when they controlled the House and Senate, didn't touch immigration either. So I think that in terms of any kind of immigration legislation, no matter who's been in the White House, no matter who's controlled the government, we've not seemed to be able to tackle that in the last few years. I will give the previous administration credit for this, however. They did secure the border. And this administration has clearly turned it into an open border. And if Title 42 is in effect revoked, it will be even more open, which is why you have a bipartisan opposition to that step, if it is ultimately taken by the administration, on full display here in Congress.
Senator McConnell, I'm not sure if you saw this, but earlier this week, The Economist magazine said on its cover that the Federal Reserve was principally to blame for America's cycle of inflation, arguing that it could have taken steps earlier to combat inflation and failed to do so. When you think economically about America's cycle of inflation, how much responsibility or blame do you think the Federal Reserve deserves?
Well, I agree with Larry Summers, who said in February of 21 that dumping $1.9 trillion on the American economy, which was the American Rescue Plan, which every single Democrat voted for and not a single Republican voted for, would produce 40-year inflation. This is Bill Clinton, Secretary of the Treasury, a top official in the Obama administration, saying to his Democratic party in full control of the government that dumping $1.9 trillion on the economy in 21 would create record inflation. It has. We've got the highest inflation in 40 years. So it'll be left up to the Fed now to try to figure out how to squeeze this inflation out of our economy. And it's likely to produce, as almost everyone predicts, a painful result.
When you use the phrase painful result, there's an R word in there, but there's another R word that might be applicable: recession. Are you fearful one could be coming?
That is the prediction, that as you squeeze inflation out, it potentially produces the downside of a recession. That's what happened in 80, 81. But the point is, in terms of who to point the finger at, it's pretty clear. The Democratic government, the president, the House, the Senate, one party only, dumped $2 trillion on the economy in 2021, and it produced exactly, as Larry Summers predicted, record inflation going back to the early 80s.
Is there anything in your calculus, politically or economically, that argues inflation isn't the only thing happening in the US economy of significance? The White House argues all the time that unemployment is near record lows, there's been huge job gains, and that there have been gains in wages, maybe not keeping pace in every respect with inflation, but significant nonetheless. Your thoughts?
Well, it's good that unemployment is low, but we do have a very low labor participation rate, which is not good. However, all of this growth is overcome by the cost of everything. The wage increases don't anywhere nearly match the cost, and everybody's seeing the price at the pump, the price in the grocery store. Inflation is the most wicked hit to medium and low income families you can imagine. So no, this is not a healthy economy. Look at how the American people feel about it. It's massive numbers. 60, 70% of the last poll I saw are not happy with the American economy. So no effort to fool them into thinking that times are good is going to work.
Again, thinking about the overall theme, American leadership at home and abroad, if the prognosticators are correct, and I'm not a prognosticator, but I know how to read them, and Republicans win the House and maybe the House and the Senate, how will American leadership abroad and at home look different?
Well, for one thing, if I become the majority leader and we have a majority in the House as well, what I intend to do is to help the president keep his commitment to the American people when he ran for president, that he would be a moderate. So far, that's not the way this administration has functioned. But with a Republican Congress and in particular Republican Senate, I think there's a good chance we can make the president keep his commitment to operate in the middle. When the American people elect divided government, I think what they're saying is, if you're a football fan, operate within the 40-yard lines. Look for things you can do that are worth doing, upon which you can get bipartisan agreement and a presidential signature. We actually were able to do that a couple of times in this current Congress with infrastructure and with postal reform, both bills that I supported that I thought were examples of things within the 40-yard lines that you could get bipartisan agreement. So that's how the last 2 years of the Biden presidency would be conducted if you had a Congress of a different party.
And would there be investigatory zeal among Senate Republicans if you are the majority leader?
Oh, I think so. I mean, the opposition party always engages in more aggressive oversight than House or Senate majorities of the same party as the president. It's fairly common, usually pretty healthy for an administration to have that kind of oversight. And I think that would be reasonable to expect.
Senator McConnell, our thanks for your thoughts on American leadership at home and abroad. We'll see you more on Capitol Hill.